Cooler days mean cozy food for me and my family. I'm making a vegetable beef stew tonight for dinner. And I thought while I was already in the kitchen cutting up things like this, I'd go ahead and make the caramel apple French toast casserole off of my blog. If you go to raisingarrows.net and type in French toast casserole, it'll pop up with the caramel apple French toast casserole. This recipe is a great way to use up leftover bread. I had actually made a couple of loaves of bread, some of sourdough and some of white bread, but I wanted to use up these bagels that a friend of mine had left at our house. We just weren't eating them, and this is a great way to use up those bagels. Now, to tell you a little bit about this bread, the white bread recipe comes from Rose Red Homestead here on YouTube, and the sourdough loaf came from a recipe from Farmhouse on Boone. Now, I gathered up all of my ingredients and I had printed out my recipe. I had some apples that I also needed to use up. So I'm going to get started here by just buttering my dish. I'm using a 10 by 15 here. You could use a 9 by 13. And honestly, you could just spray it with cooking spray if you wanted to as well. I'm simply going to start by layering about half of the bread. I'm just going to tear it up and put it on the bottom of this pan. So if you were using a loaf of bread, you would tear up about half the loaf of bread and put it along the bottom of the pan. I don't always make a breakfast for the kids. In fact, I rarely make breakfast for the kids because we kind of straggle in the morning and they just find different things that I have laid out for them. But it's nice to have a casserole available for them, even if you make it in the afternoon and have it there for several breakfasts. Instead of trying to get up in the morning and make something fresh, if you just make a casserole ahead of time and keep it in the refrigerator, it's something easy for the kids to grab in the morning. The theme of the day seems to be using up things. This was a block of cream cheese that obviously somebody had taken some slices off of, probably for a bagel. Rather than grabbing a fresh block of cream cheese, I might as well just use this one. This recipe is very forgiving, and so I can just take what I have and put it into the casserole dish. Looking back, I should have just pulled these apart with my fingers instead of trying to cut them because they are just a gooey mess. And when I went to put them into the casserole, I did end up still kind of pulling them apart with my fingers and placing them strategically throughout the casserole. So you're just kind of wanting to cover it nicely. You want the pieces to not be so huge that all you're getting is a mouthful of cream cheese. You want to have just a nice bit of flavor in there with the bread and the eggs and the caramel glaze. As I said before, these were apples that were needing to be used up. They were just Granny Smith. They were what I had on hand because we had an apple tasting party for our homeschool, and I'd bought a lot of different apples, and these were the ones that I had left. So I just chopped these up and sprinkled them throughout the casserole as well. This recipe only requires a couple of apples, but you could add more if you wanted, or add nuts or dried fruit. With using the bagels that I did, some of those things were already in those bagels, and it made for a really delicious casserole. You might notice I am cracking the eggs and then putting the shells right back into the carton. I had just enough eggs to make this recipe, and I really hate this carton. I got it from Sam's, and so I just threw the shells back in there so that I could throw it away later. For this next step, all you're doing is putting together eggs and milk and cinnamon just the way that you would for regular French toast. You whisk it up really good, incorporate all the ingredients, and then you just pour that over the casserole. I'm using Ty's Granny's old yellow Pyrex bowl. I always think of her when I use this bowl. She gave it to me before she died, and I just so enjoy having it as part of my kitchen. Right after I poured the eggs over the casserole, I realized I had not put the rest of the bread into the casserole. And that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to put the other half of the bread on top of the apples and the cream cheese, and then pour the eggs over the top, making sure that you soak all of those bread pieces really well. And this is one reason that I don't particularly like to cook on camera, because this is just how my life is. I am a very haphazard cook, and I forget things and I leave things out and I have to come back and fix things later, and it is a big colossal mess, but I guess it's real life. You're really getting to see how I cook. And so I had to go back in with a wooden spoon and kind of smush everything down into the eggs to make sure that it was coated well. Now to make the caramel glaze. I so love this caramel glaze, and it is super, super simple. You're just taking butter and brown sugar and maple syrup, and that is your glaze. And you just whisk that all up until it is a lovely caramel color, and that goes over the top of your casserole. Recipes like this one just scream fall, with the caramel and the apple and just this warm and toasty bread in there. And so this is one of those recipes that I actually don't think I ever make outside of autumn. And once it gets to be the fall season and things start cooling down, this is one of those recipes that becomes a go-to for me, and I really enjoy making it. I'm just going to pop this in a 350-degree oven for 35 minutes while my little poodle Winston looks on, and it'll be ready for the kids to eat for breakfast for several days to come. And here it is in all its delicious autumn goodness.